The 9 most beloved guests from Johnny Carson's golden heyday were unveiled. After dark, Johnny Carson welcomed America inside his living room for 30 years. From timid novices to Hollywood greats, he interviewed over 22,000 people throughout his time on The Tonight Show. Carson had a much smaller list, though, of the exceptional guests who did more than entertain for his audience. They formed true relationships with the man behind the desk. An ex-Tonight Show producer who collaborated with Carson for 15 years described Johnny as the epitome of professionalism. However, there were some visitors who had the ability to make him forget that cameras were there. Johnny had stepped down as host by the time they arrived. His only intention was to have fun. Before we can grasp the depth of Carson's adoration for the individual at the top of his list, we must grasp the emotional moment that exposed the authenticity of their connection. It's Bo is the name of it now. The dog goes by that name. The man who moved Carson to tears, Jimmy Stewart. What viewers saw on Jimmy Stewart's Tonight Show appearance was extraordinary. When he was in the company of true Hollywood aristocracy, Johnny Carson, television's unflappable host, turned into a grateful devotee. Jimmy was everything America wanted to believe about itself, Carson remarked to a close friend some time ago. The genuine article in a field rife with imposters, decent, modest, and genuine. Everyone, even Carson, looked forward to Stewart's appearances every year. In contrast to other elderly celebrities who depend on scripted stories, Stewart gave his interviews an honest, occasionally nervous air that Carson found endearing. Johnny respected that Jimmy never tried to be slick, explained a former Tonight Show producer. He stumbled over words sometimes. He paused to find the right expression. He was just being himself, not performing Jimmy Stewart the way some celebrities would perform versions of themselves. What truly cemented Stewart's place as Carson's favorite guest was a now legendary 1981 appearance when the actor read his poem "Bee" about the death of his beloved dog. The simple, heartfelt verses about his golden retriever caused Carson, famous for his emotional restraint, to visibly tear up on national television. "I've never seen Johnny react that way to anything," said a camera operator who was there that evening. Once Stewart made his appearance, his reputation was irrevocably cemented. He was genuinely moved, and he didn't try to hide it or make a joke to break the tension. He just let himself have that human moment with Jimmy in the audience. Employees at Carson's understood that their usually demanding boss, Stewart, would be in his most giving mood when he was booked. If it were possible, Johnny would actually ask us to extend Jimmy's segments, an ex-producer claimed. The kind of scheduling alteration he would propose. "See if we can give him another few minutes. Move the commercial if you have to," was quite unusual. What Carson said about Stewart while the cameras weren't rolling was probably the most revealing. In production meetings, Carson would allegedly bring up Stewart's interviews as instances of flawless television, genuine moments that proved the necessity of the medium. According to his close associates, Stewart was one of the few celebrities that Carson personally contacted to thank on the night of his last show in 1992. The sincere bond between the most reclusive TV host and the most real Hollywood celebrity was conveyed through this gesture. The next favorite of Carson's delivered something quite different, in contrast to Stewart's dignified and emotive side. A deftness with the time that was equal to Carson's. Help him feel at home. Allow me to introduce you to Bob Newhart. Bob Newhart, the comic who seemed to have no trouble pulling it off. If Jimmy Stewart won Carson over emotionally, Bob Newhart would win him over comically. He had Carson's impeccable timing, sharp wit, and capacity to find humor in everyday life. The stand-up comic later became a sitcom star. A writer who worked on The Tonight Show in the 70s and 80s claimed that Johnny once named Bob the most effortlessly funny man he knew. There was no greater praise than what Carson offered. Newhart's conversational style set him apart from the other comedians that participated on the show. Instead of coming with rehearsed lines or repurposed material from his act, Newhart had an honest conversation with Carson, the strategy that played to the host's strengths to perfection. According to a director who was involved with several of Newhart's appearances, they have remarkable timing together. To Bob, the story would begin. Johnny always managed to insert the perfect remark at the perfect time. Bob would progress from there. Observing the two jazz performers was like being a fly on the wall. By violating his own rules in order to welcome comedian Newhart, Carson showed his admiration for Hart. Carson, who is usually quite rigid about staying on topic, would often allow Newhart's segments go on for too long, and he would even beg producers to make his portions longer than others. According to one ex-producer, Johnny would just let Bob go if he was performing well. To postpone the commercial break, he would signal to the control room by making the extend it sign. For the majority of his guests, he would be anxiously awaiting their departure. It was something he never wanted to end with Bob. Newhart's modesty was something that Carson liked very much. No matter how successful he was, Newhart never showed up with a posse or any particular requests. He was humble and appreciative of the chance to be on the show, and he was respectful to the crew members. The producer clarified that prima donnas were Johnny's Achilles heel. Bob stands in stark contrast, talking to the pages, thanking the makeup artists, and even recalling the names of camera operators he'd met years before were all part of his job. Those things were noticed by Johnny. After first working together, the two men became friends and even went golfing together once in a while. This showed that Carson, who was known for keeping his personal and professional lives apart, enjoyed Newhart's company and was happy to have him around. According to a Carson acquaintance who has known Johnny for a long time, if Johnny asked you to play golf, it showed he liked you more than just a guest. Among the handful of famous people who did it, Bob was one. Although Carson loved Newhart's subtle cerebral comedy, his next favorite visitor contributed something completely different. Charmingly unpredictable and full of surprises that had Carson guessing. Is Burt Reynolds someone you would welcome? With music playing and applause ringing out, we have Burt Reynolds, the ideal accomplice. Viewers realized they weren't witnessing a standard interview when Burt Reynolds made an appearance on The Tonight Show. What they were seeing was two guys who loved competing with each other in a pleasant way. The game is won by Burt, guests typically do not. After the mustachioed actor made an unforgettable appearance, Carson allegedly notified a producer. While he was at the peak of his career in the 1970s, Reynolds saw something important about television that most other famous people didn't. The most effective kind of the host-guest dynamic was a light-hearted collaboration, not a mere commercial opportunity. According to a former Tonight Show writer, Johnny really appreciated Burt's performance, and it wasn't only to promote a movie. Publicists had prepared talking points for most celebrities before they came. Burt showed there, concealed in his jacket carrying water pistols. An iconic part of Reynolds' performances is their infamous prank battles. A notorious incident occurred when, in the middle of what was intended to be a serious discussion about a forthcoming film, Reynolds assaulted Carson with shaving cream. Carson was really exhilarated by the surprise attack rather than irritated by it. Staff members said he really appreciated Reynolds' desire to change up the usually predictable talk show format, and that he laughed more off camera than in front of the audience. As a kid, Johnny is all about surprises. Unlike the scripted "I didn't expect that" question moments that most celebrities practice, Reynolds' appearances were genuine surprises. According to a filmmaker who had worked with her on several occasions, Johnny greatly appreciated that Burt was one of the rare guests who could truly surprise him. Reynolds could both take and give jokes, which Carson found quite endearing. Reynolds would laugh along with Carson's jokes about his unsuccessful films and high-profile relationships, without displaying the typical Hollywood vulnerability. An old producer spilled the beans about Johnny's test for genuine celebrity crushes. Would they be able to take his teasing in stride? It was a cakewalk for Burt on that test. He did more than just laugh it off. He actually seemed to enjoy it. It was clear that Carson and Reynolds were really friends from the way he talked about Reynolds when he wasn't on the show. Workers claim that Carson often used Reynolds' past performances as a model for how other guests should act on the talk show while getting ready to host them. An on-air talent coordinator noted that Johnny would reassure anxious guests by saying, "Just relax and have fun with it." This is similar to Burt Reynolds' approach. To him, that was the pinnacle of compliments. The next favorite guest of Carson's brought something quite different. In contrast to Reynolds' carefree, unpredictable attitude, Carson was able to reveal a side of himself that is never seen on television thanks to his intellectual depth. "You had remained unharmed during our time on the same stage. I agree with you. It won't hurt anything. You appeared on that show after that. Carson was captivated by the genius Orson Welles. Most people's mental image of Johnny Carson is of the charming, humorous host who was known for his celebrity interviews and stand-up routines. However, Carson's intellectual side was most apparent during Orson Welles' appearance on The Tonight Show, as was obvious to those who knew him well. An executive who oversaw multiple of Welles' presentations claimed that Johnny was truly amazed by Orson. He was intellectually enthralled, rather than starstruck, as he occasionally appeared with Jimmy Stewart. Johnny would study up on topics he believed Orson might cover when his appointment was set. Arts, literature, and history. When it came to other guests, he never did that. They had various kind of conversations which set Welles apart from Carson's other favorites. Their conversation drifted away from promotional talk and Hollywood rumors and into art, politics, magic, and history, exposing depths to Carson that even longtime watchers were shocked by. According to a journalist who was closely associated with Carson, those interviews revealed a side of Johnny that his friends recognized, but the general public seldom saw. Knowledgeable, inquisitive, and as at home in a discussion about Shakespeare as he is in a joke about giraffes. The famed director's live magic performance on national television was one of his most famous appearances. Astonishingly complex illusions that pleased Carson, a man with a long-time fascination in magic, and truly shocked the team. A camera operator remarked that Johnny's expression during those maneuvers was just priceless. His mind was as open and wide as a child's during a magic show. Johnny went to the camera during the commercial break after a particularly stunning illusion and asked, "Did you folks at home see that? That was real magic, not TV magic." Carson really liked Welles because he was genuine. Carson found Welles' candor refreshing in a profession that relied on carefully managed reputations, because he would talk about his mistakes just as much as his achievements, despite his towering reputation as one of the best directors of all time. According to a producer, Orson would openly discuss his experiences with movie firings or canceled projects, avoiding the typical Hollywood gloss. That forthrightness was highly respected by Johnny. When famous people pretended that everything they touched became valuable, he despised it. Carson never tried to push Welles or guide him toward more approachable subjects, even though their discussion occasionally got so deep that it defied the light entertainment style of The Tonight Show. On the contrary, he appeared to thoroughly enjoy the chance to interact beyond the scope of his typical interviews. An associate of Carson's disclosed, "Johnny once told me those conversations with Orson were some of the most satisfying moments of his career." He pointed out, "For a few minutes I get to be myself rather than Johnny Carson," if that makes any sense. While Welles represented the intellectual stimulation Carson craved, his next favorite guest embodied something equally important to the host, the comedy tradition that shaped his own career. Legend. Would you welcome, please, Jack Benny. Jack Benny, the master who inspired Carson. When Jack Benny appeared on The Tonight Show, viewers witnessed a rare reversal of Carson's usual demeanor. The normally composed, controlling host transformed into an appreciative student in the presence of one of comedy's greatest pioneers. "He was the reason I do what I do," Carson once admitted to a close colleague after a Benny appearance. "Watching him was my masterclass in comedy." Benny's influence on Carson's style was evident to anyone familiar with their respective careers. You have impeccable timing, you react subtly, and you can make others laugh with a glance or a pause. Everything that Carson had learned from Benny and used in his own performances. An author who collaborated with Carson in the 1970s said that Johnny's whole comedic philosophy originated with Jack. The host didn't have to rely on punchlines to keep the audience engaged. Reactions could be funnier than deeds, and silence could elicit more laughs than words. That was classic Benny, and Johnny was aware of it. Carson was clearly enamored with Benny when he visited The Tonight Show. Unlike other guests, he would laugh more heartily and listen with greater attention. Employees claimed that Carson would physically rearrange the interview arrangement so that Benny could get the best shots. Johnny would actually tell the directors, "Make sure you get Jack's reactions, not mine," recalled a former producer. That was unheard of. Carson literally directing attention away from himself to showcase someone else. It showed how much he respected Benny's mastery. What made these appearances particularly special was the generational torch passing they represented. Benny, born in 1894, had pioneered radio comedy when Carson was just a child. By the time Benny appeared on The Tonight Show in the 1970s, he was in his late 70s and early 80s. Yet his timing remained impeccable. Watching Johnny interact with Jack was like seeing comedy history in real time, noted a director who worked on several of Benny's appearances. Here was the current king of late night talking with the man who had essentially invented the formula decades earlier. Johnny never forgot that lineage. Carson's respect for Benny extended far beyond their on-air interactions. According to those close to Carson, he kept a framed photo of Benny in his office, the only celebrity picture he displayed in his private workspace. That photo said everything about who Johnny admired most, explained a longtime friend. Not the biggest stars of the moment or even his own image, but the man who had shown him what television comedy could be at its best. While Benny represented Carson's comedy lineage, his next favorite guest brought something equally valuable. Authentic warmth that made every appearance feel like a genuine reunion rather than a professional obligation. It can't be possible that it was 1967 when Harvey, Vicky, Lyle, and I stepped on the stage for the first time. Carol Burnett, the guest who brought sunshine. When Carol Burnett appeared on The Tonight Show, something remarkable happened. Johnny Carson, television's most controlled performer, would visibly relax. His shoulders would loosen, his smile would widen, and the invisible barrier he typically maintained between himself and his guests would momentarily disappear. Carol brings sunshine to the stage, Carson reportedly told Ed McMahon after one of Burnett's many appearances. Burnett stood out among Carson's regulars thanks to the undeniable chemistry they shared. Their dialogue had the casual ease of old friends reuniting, in contrast to the more stiff cadence of most interviews on The Tonight Show. A director who had worked on numerous appearances by Burnett remarked, "With most guests, Johnny was clearly the host and they were clearly the visitor. When I was with Carol, it was as if we were two equals taking pleasure in each other's presence." Immediately, the audience could feel the change. During his performances, Carson occasionally let entertainers like Burnett go totally off script. Burnett, in contrast to the other celebrities, was allowed complete freedom to go off on tangents, start games on the spot, or even interview Carson himself, rather than being carefully guided through planned talking points. An ex-producer made the observation that Johnny had total faith in Carol. He had faith in her ability to read the room, believed she would never bring shame on the show or herself, and most importantly, that her impromptu choices would always be amusing. It was quite unusual to find that degree of trust. Her total lack of pretense was Carson's favorite thing about Burnett. Despite her tremendous success on The Carol Burnett Show, she came to The Tonight Show with a small entourage, no particular requests, and true gratitude for the people who worked on the set. An enduring employee claimed that Carol could recall the identities of makeup artists and camera operators she had crossed paths with many years before. When she wanted to know about their families, she would inquire and pay attention. Johnny took note of those details and placed a high value on them. When Burnett showed there, Carson disregarded his own rules, revealing their true affection for one another. He would often bump other guests to allow her extra airtime, even though he was usually tight about keeping segments to their allocated time, just so she could make an appearance. An ex-director related the incident of how Johnny would ignore the producer's cues to finish up if Carol was engrossed in a particularly compelling scene. No matter how famous the guests were, that nearly never happened. When Burnett wasn't on the show, Carson still made reference to her often, which is probably the most revealing sign of his affection for her. Members of Carson's staff claim that the talk show host frequently looked to Burnett's past performances as a model for how subsequent guests should act. Following Burnett, Carson's next favorite guest added something just as valuable: warmth and spontaneity. True manhood stripped of the Hollywood facade. This is the last series, and just like that, a new weekly series has arrived. Yeah, I was under the impression that I could play golf non-stop, but as you well know, it bothers James Garner. Such a Hollywood celebrity ought to be. Viewers felt more like they were listening in on a conversation between two average guys than they were seeing a promotional appearance by a movie star when James Garner took his seat on The Tonight Show couch. "He's the epitome of a movie star, and that's saying something," Johnny joked with a producer following one of Garner's several appearances. The thing that Carson liked best about Garner was how genuine he was. Carson appreciated Garner's refreshingly unpretentious performance on The Tonight Show, in contrast to many Hollywood leading males who appeared to be performing even when the cameras weren't rolling. "Johnny could spot a phony from a mile away," explained a longtime talent supervisor on the show. "James was the antithesis of fake. Cameras were rolling or not. What you saw was exactly what you got." The Hollywood tales told by Garner had an unusually realistic feel, rather than waxing poetic about his experiences on Maverick and The Great Escape. He centered his stories on the human side of things, including the friendships he forged with his crew, the practical jokes they pulled between takes, and the blunders that never made it into the official Hollywood accounts. A writer who was involved in multiple of Garner's appearances made the observation that James discussed being a movie star in the same way that most people discuss their office occupations. His description of Steve McQueen's tantrum would be more akin to someone's description of a troublesome coworker, affectionately exasperated, completely lacking in reverence. Garner maintained this approachability even while he wasn't on camera. Multiple sources inside the team attest that he showed up with a small entourage, thanked the whole crew, and accorded the same level of respect to everyone from the pages to the producers. Longtime producer. Johnny's appreciation for such conduct was greater than most people believed, the source stated. Guests' treatment of staff members when they believed no one was looking was something he carefully noted. James was always the top performer on that exam. The way Garner could bring disparate cultures together was what set him apart as one of Carson's favorite actors. He had the ability to captivate Carson's elder audience with tales about Hollywood giants, while still appealing to the younger generation with an approachable, modern perspective. Despite collaborating with A-listers like Marlon Brando and Julie Andrews, James never once boasted or made a passing reference to himself. The producer continued, "Johnny loved that he could reference old Hollywood without sounding like he was stuck in the past." The genuine friendship between the two men was evident in their on-air comfort with each other. Carson, typically careful to maintain some professional distance with guests, would occasionally reference private conversations or shared experiences with Garner, a rare breach of the wall he usually maintained between his public and private lives. While Garner represented unpretentious authenticity that Carson valued, his next favorite guest brought something equally precious, living history that connected Carson to comedy's golden age. "This is my 10th or 11th cigar. Smoke between 15 and 20 cigars a day. Yeah, George Burns, the legend who kept getting better." When George Burns appeared on The Tonight Show, particularly in his later years, viewers witnessed something extraordinary. Johnny Carson, television's unquestioned king, treating his guest with the deference normally reserved for visiting royalty. At 80, 90, and eventually over 100 years old, Burns represented something Carson deeply respected: longevity in a notoriously fickle business, and the living connection to vaudeville. The entertainment tradition that had shaped Carson's own comedic sensibilities. Johnny would actually get nervous before George's appearances, revealed a producer who worked on several of Burns' visits to the show. Not because he was worried about the interview going badly, but because he had such enormous respect for George's place in comedy history. It was like watching a concert pianist prepare to play for Mozart. What made Burns unique among Carson's favorites was how he improved with age. While many older performers relied on recycling past glories, Burns continued to evolve his act well into his 90s, bringing fresh material and sharp observations to each appearance. Johnny used to say that George was the only person in Hollywood who got funnier as he got older. Recalled a writer who worked on The Tonight Show during the 1980s. He'd say, "Most of us peak and then hang on. George just keeps climbing." Carson's respect was evident in how he conducted these interviews, typically the master of his domain, who gently guided conversations where he wanted them to go. With Burns, Carson would often simply ask a question and then lean back, giving the comedy legend complete control of the segment. Johnny would sometimes go 2 or 3 minutes without saying anything when George was on a roll, noted a director who worked on many of Burns's appearances. For Carson, who typically jumped in every 30 seconds with most guests, that was extraordinary. He knew great comedy when he saw it, and he wasn't going to interrupt it. Burns himself recognized the special treatment he received. In his autobiography, he wrote, "If Johnny Carson likes you, you're bulletproof in this business." And for some reason, I can't explain, Johnny always liked me. The reason, according to those who knew Carson well, was simple. Burns embodied the professionalism, timing, and dedication to craft that Carson valued above all else. George never missed a beat, never flubbed a punchline, never forgot where he was going with a story, explained a longtime producer. Johnny, who prided himself on those same qualities, saw Burns as the ultimate example of what a comedian should be. Someone who made incredibly difficult work look effortless. Perhaps most telling was how Carson treated Burns during commercial breaks. According to crew members, Carson, who typically used these moments to confer with producers or prepare for the next segment, would remain fully engaged with Burns when the cameras weren't rolling, often asking him questions about performers from the 1920s and 30s who had influenced Carson's own development. Johnny was getting a private masterclass in comedy history during those breaks, noted a camera operator who witnessed many of these interactions, and he treasured every minute of it. While Burns connected Carson to comedy's roots, his final favorite guest represented something equally significant: female comedy pioneering that paralleled Carson's own television innovations. He's a fine pro. I like pros. Yeah, I like pros that show up. Lucille Ball, television royalty. When Lucille Ball appeared on The Tonight Show, two television pioneers shared the stage, each having transformed the medium in their own way. While Carson had reinvented late-night television, Ball had revolutionized the sitcom format a generation earlier. She's royalty, Carson told his audience during Ball's appearance on his 10th anniversary special, a rare moment when he openly acknowledged his admiration for a guest. What made Ball's appearances special wasn't just her comedic talents, though those remained sharp throughout her career, but the mutual respect evident between two performers who understood the challenges of television better than perhaps anyone else in the industry. They both knew what it meant to carry a show week after week, year after year, explained a producer who worked with both stars at different points in his career. They'd both felt the pressure of millions of people tuning in expecting to be entertained. That created a bond that was obvious whenever they were together. Carson, normally careful to maintain his position as the center of The Tonight Show, would visibly defer to Ball during her appearances, giving her the best camera angles, laughing genuinely at her jokes and showing a warmth that went beyond his usual professional courtesy. Johnny treated Lucy like the queen of television, which in many ways she was, recalled a director who worked on several of Ball's appearances. He would actually tell the camera operators before the show, "Make sure you get her reactions, not just mine." That was practically unheard of. One of the most touching moments between them came during a 1973 appearance, when Carson surprised Ball with footage from her earliest screen test, material she hadn't seen in decades. According to those present, Ball was visibly moved, briefly tearing up before recovering with a characteristic quip. That moment revealed so much about their relationship, noted a former Tonight Show writer. Johnny knew exactly what would touch her without being exploitative, and Lucy trusted him enough to show genuine emotion, rather than just her polished public persona. What Carson particularly appreciated about Ball was her pioneering role as a businesswoman in an industry dominated by men. As the first female head of a major television studio, Ball had broken barriers that Carson, who formed his own production company, deeply respected. Johnny once told me that Lucy was the smartest person in television. Not just the funniest woman, but the smartest person, period, revealed a friend who knew both stars. He admired how she had navigated Hollywood as both a performer and an executive, when women weren't supposed to be either. The genuine affection between them was evident in how Carson broke his own rules when Ball appeared. Typically strict about keeping segments to their allocated time, he would frequently extend her appearances, sometimes even bumping other guests to give her more airtime. When the producer would signal that it was time to wrap up, Johnny would sometimes just wave them off if Lucy was in the middle of a good story. explained a former director. That almost never happened with other guests, no matter how famous they were. Perhaps most telling was how Carson spoke about Ball when she wasn't on the show. According to staff members, Carson would often reference her when discussing the challenges of television with other guests, citing her work ethic and resilience as models for the industry. Lucy represented everything Johnny valued in a performer, explained a longtime producer. Talent without pretension, success without arrogance, and most importantly, the understanding that television was both an art form and a business, and you had to master both sides to truly succeed.